Hello, welcome to today's lecture in HNS 604, Research and Communication Science for MSN, Part 1 of Department of Nursing Sciences, University of Nairobi. My name is L.K.B. So today we want to look at epistemology in relation to research methods. Specifically, we want to have a short or simplified overview of philosophy. We want to describe epistemology, discuss how epistemology guides research methods, and probably be able to discuss how the knowledge you would have learned today will be applied in your individual research project. So let's start by looking at what is philosophy. Philosophy is derived from the word philein sophia, meaning lover of wisdom. If philosophy means lover of wisdom or love of wisdom, then are we all philosophers? Or does it just entail academic work? The Web Dictionary defines philosophy as the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, existent, and especially when those aspects are considered within an academic discipline. Philosophy can also be seen as an attitude or a theory that acts as a guiding principle for behavior. It is an activity people undertake when they seek to understand a phenomenon. So that tells you or tells us that philosophy is active. Philosophy is what we do rather than what we learn about it. And that brings us to the question, what is researchers' philosophical approach to knowledge? Okay, so having looked at what philosophy is all about, we want to see how philosophy relates to research. Now, we've said philosophy investigates nature, causes, principles of reality, knowledge, and values. It then means that philosophy is based on logical reasoning rather than empirical methods. And American Heritage Dictionary further emphasizes that. If research then is developing knowledge or building intellectual capital, it means that researchers' assumption on how we perceive the world is incorporated in pursuit of philosophy. Research methods then best try to understand the world. And looking at it keenly or from a different perspective, if searching, or the word research, involves searching again and again, hence called research, it means there must be a diligent, systematic, inquisitive process to establish that knowledge. Because if you did the wrong search and did another search which was wrong, then you would just be doing zero work. But it has to be very systematic. That means you need to have careful consideration, diligent search, you have to have detailed study. If it is systematic, inquisitive, diligent, and detailed, then it means the search of knowledge must go beyond personal experiences, imagination, and thoughts. And that's the only way we can be able to say that the search of knowledge is purposeful and is done in order to answer a question. Research methodology basically deals with how we go about acquiring knowledge. All right. So, the next step, I want us to look at three very important aspects in the pursuit of knowledge. So, we want to look at ontology, epistemology, and axiology. Sounds very conquered, but what do they actually mean? Ontology deals with what is there to be known. It's just something we don't know and we need to know. Then epistemology deals with what and how we can know about that which we need to know. Then we ask ourselves, are we doing it for the sake of it? Does it add any value? Does it create a theory? Is it worth? And the worth of knowledge is called axiology. Let us see how those three terms play out in the outlook of philosophy. We'll do that by the aid of a diagram. And before we look at the diagram, let me say that philosophy has been classified in different ways. For the purposes of this lecture, we're just going to look at two aspects of philosophy. Let's take a moment and look at that diagram. We have research philosophy. How do we acquire knowledge about research? And as the diagram shows, it is classified or divided into two branches. Ontology, if you remember, we said ontology is what is there to know. And what is there to know is dictated by the nature of reality, as we shall see in the subsequent slides. We can say that metaphysics is a way of dealing with the ultimate nature of reality. So, while metaphysics deals with the nature of reality, we have the other branch which looks at epistemology. Epistemology, as we say, is how we acquire knowledge. It has interpretivism, positivism, and post-positivism. We'll now take a moment and look at each of those concepts and see what they mean. Okay, so we have realism, and realism is a term which refers to reality, a true reality that exists. There's a true reality that exists, tangible, whether us human know it or not. That true reality can be perceived through our senses. We can touch the reality, we can hear the reality, we can smell the reality, we can taste the reality. Let's see other terms which have been used to describe realism. The Oxford Dictionary defines realism as the attitude of or practice of accepting a situation as it is and being prepared to deal with it accordingly. That means it is what it is. You cannot change it. The quality of that reality or the facts of representing a person, a thing, in or a phenomena in a way that is accurate and true to life constitutes realism. So, realism proposes that there is a real objective existence of things. Those things exist irrespective of our perception. If today we sit and say Indian Ocean does not exist, the truth, as we know, is Indian Ocean exists. You have been there. You may have gone and swum there. So, even if anyone sat and told you the Indian Ocean does not exist, you know they would be denying reality because there's evidence that it is there. And we can use our senses to actually confirm the existence of Indian Ocean and many other things. So realism views the world as a compound of matters. And the realism actually perceives the mind as an empty vessel that can be filled with knowledge from without. So, as you experience this reality, your mind then records the existence of that reality. So, realism focuses at what actually is. What is there, it is not debatable. It is there and it does exist. Okay, let us now look at the next concept, which is called idealism. Remember, ontology is about existence of reality. What is reality? How do we perceive it? So, idealism brings another different angle. In idealism, it is all in your mind. So because it's all in your mind, it does not necessarily have to exist physically. Let's look at that in a few more details. Now, idealism according to the American Dictionary is any of the various systems of thought in which the object of knowledge are held to be in some way dependent on the activity of the mind. So if today the mind tells me there exists a child with COVID in Mandela, for example, I may not be sure whether it's actually there or there's such a child. But that child exists in my mind. So, idealism associates reality to ideas in the mind rather than to material objects. Idealism envisions things in an ideal or perfect manner. You've heard somebody says, ideally, we should not be having starving children in Kajiado district, for example. It musically talks about what could be. That idealism is usually out of mental work or our experiences. Idealism rejects physical reality. More often than not, it emphasizes more on the spiritual world. Let's try and bring it closer home. Let's say in this room we are surrounded by angels, for those who believe in God. Have you ever touched an angel? Have you smelled an angel? But do they exist? In our minds, in our hearts, spiritually, we may feel that the angels exist. But practically, in reality, all people who view world in a realism way will tell you it's all in the mind. Okay, so we have realism, which is very objective world, tangible. We have idealism, which is a perception of the mind. So what is this third ontological aspect called pragmatic realism? Pragmatic realism is all about practical experience. Let's see what we mean by that. So the word pragma can be translated as to do, to accomplish. It is linked to action and experiences. So it means reality is determined by one's sense of experience. So I have experienced heat. I have lived in a hot environment. So my experience will tell me that living at the coast, for example, can be very hot. So my reality is determined by my sense of experience. Man can know nothing beyond his experience. Well, maybe I may never have experienced cold, freezing cold. So to me, it does not exist. I have not experienced it. So when we look at pragmatism, we realize that the reality is constantly changing, because if my reality is based on what I experience, then it means that my record of what exists is filled or is dictated by experiences. The more experiences I have, the more varying my realism exists. So pragmatic realism. Now, pragmatic realism does not believe in anything spiritual, because if I have not lived it, then it does not exist. If my view of the world is pragmatic realism. So, realism in pragmatism is based on functional knowledge and experience. In research, it could be linked with asking questions like, what works best? It is also linked to practical philosophy. What works? What works in Africa? What works among the Maasais? What works in developed countries? What works in Northeastern? What works in different aspects and phenomena we are concerned about? Then comes yet another form of ontology, and it's called critical realism. Remember, ontology answers the question, what is there to know and what is the nature of reality? So there is tangible reality, there is imaginary reality, there is pragmatic reality, what you actually experience, and then we bring critical realism. What is critical realism? Critical realism are experience sensations, or those sensations we experience, the image of things in the world and not the things directly. This is rather interesting. Critical realism basically goes like this. This bottle you see here is not a bottle. It is an image of something which is in the real world and not the thing directly. Critical realism basically looks at reality in a very complex way. At times it will be said that you look at reality as a combination of idealism and realism. So that is how ontology is approached. Now, let's take a moment and look at epistemology. So, while ontology looks at reality, epistemology looks at how we know or how we acquire knowledge about that reality. So epistemology is concerned about knowledge, its acquisition, and its justification. Epistemology is informed by evidence, experiences of different disciplines. When they come together, then they inform epistemology. Unknown caller. Sorry about that. And so, epistemology looks at methods. In this case, methods are vehicles or strategic guides we use to acquire knowledge about reality. So we ask ourselves, is knowledge of reality possible? Whether it is idealism, whether it is pragmatism, how do we gain knowledge about the reality? Whether reality is real or imaginary, how do we acquire knowledge about that reality? So does science or the power of our knowledge give us reality? And if epistemology is about source and nature and validity of knowledge, then we need to ask ourselves, so what is the origin of the knowledge? Where does genuine knowledge come from? What is the nature of this knowledge in terms of reality? And whatever we call knowledge, is it valid? Is it true? Or does it have error? In other words, how do you know what you know? Knowing how you can know is what epistemology is all about. Let's look at 3 aspects of epistemology, and probably that will make it more clear. I want you to look at that diagram, and you notice that epistemology has 3 aspects. And when we are saying we want to acquire knowledge, we'll look at those three aspects. Let me start with the first aspect of interpretivism, from the word interpret. Remember, we said that idealism is reality that exists in our mind. Because it exists in our minds, we are likely to have very subjective convictions about a phenomena. And when we when we look at interpretivism as a way of acquiring knowledge, we look at the depth of variables. We want to understand a phenomena in details rather than generalize it. Relativism, subjective epistemology. Let me give you an example. If today you want to look at rabies, and one of the aspects or one of the views of a community regarding rabies is that rabies is basically the dead ancestors visiting the community, probably because they are angry. That is a very subjective view. It may not make sense to us, but it does look at the perspective of a community towards rape. So we would need probably to look at the depth of that variable. What informs that perception of that community? Are they wrong? Are they right? And so when we say that the cultural beliefs influence management of rabies in a particular community, then would just be analyzing the subjective perspective. Okay. The other aspect we want to look at is positivism. And probably this is what we are more familiar with, especially quantitative researchers. When we talk about positivism, we are referring to a few aspects. One, observable reality. You can go and count the number of nurses who work in a department. You can be able to quantify their knowledge on oxygen administration, for example. You can be able to measure that phenomena. You can give a questionnaire, you can score, and you can grade the nurses. You don't have to study all the nurses in KNH, for example, for you to know whether they have knowledge on oxygen therapy. So you get a small sample and your results are used to infer or to generalize to the larger population of nurses working at KNH. In positivism, we discover. A discovery method is where we measure observable facts. Then we look at the causal relationship between one variable or one aspect or one phenomena to another. The other thing we consider in positivism is randomness. Everyone has a chance of being picked. And then once we do randomness, then we measure association by use of statistical tests. That is about positivism. The word I want us to remember when we look at positivism is quantifiable. We can quantify and measure a phenomenon. Okay. Now look at the third aspect of epistemology, and it's called post-positivism. Post-positivism generally refers to all those approaches that historically succeeded positivism. It advocates that social realities need to be understood from the perspective of the subject, perspective of the people who are being studied, perspective of the phenomena which is being studied, rather than from that of the observer or the researcher. And we need to look at reality in totality rather than in isolation. Post-positivism basically recognizes that actors are active subjects who are productive of their social reality and not simply the object of social forces. In post-positivism, we talk of participative research, where the subjects or the study sample or the population becomes part and parcel of research. Okay, so we look at phenomena in totality. You don't judge from outside. You allow the subject to give you information or data about all what they know about an phenomena or an issue. How do all of it relate? The ontology, the epistemology, and methodology. So, ontology, we said, looks at what is reality. Epistemology asks what and how can we know or gain knowledge about that reality. Then theoretical perspective asks what approach can we use to get knowledge. The method are usually the procedures we use to capture knowledge. And methods, as we know from other researches or research topics, are tools that we use to acquire knowledge. And the sources are what data or where we collect data from. Let's try wrap this looking at how epistemology informs methodological differences. Now, that diagram looks at epistemology and methodological differences in respect to view of reality. On the extreme right, we have constructivism, which means the reality basically exists in mind. Idealism. Then on the left-hand side, we have objectivism. And in this case, there is this assumption that the world is real, it exists, it is objective, it can be quantified. Now, let's look at, just for us to help understand better, look at Jonas and David's framework of assumptions which are inherent to objectivism and constructivism, and see their assumptions on reality, might, thought, meaning, simples, and see how that brings us closer to the truth of matters. Now, objectivism basically is about universal rules. When we look at the world objectively, what do we mean? How do we perceive reality? Under objectivism, reality is external. There is a single truth. It is independent of our experiences. And reality comprises of entities, properties, and relationship between those properties can be quantified, can be explained, can be structured, and can be modeled. The mind, our mind, mirrors reality. And our mind acts as a machine that manipulates the symbols, giving them abstract meaning. We code entities to make information. On the other hand, our thoughts are actually analyzable. You can decompose our thoughts. We can look, for example, at obesity, just an example. We can be able to decompose those thoughts to atomic or atomistic levels. We have individual data, we have family data, we have population data. We can be able to do algorithms and be able to calculate what we expect to be the prevalences of obesity in all different levels of the population. The meaning we derive in objectivism basically corresponds to entities and categories. Symbols, on the other hand, are representation of external reality and are building blocks. So, if that is our view of reality and objectivism, mind, thoughts, and meaning and symbols in a real world with universal laws, then what research methods would we apply when we are looking at an objective world? Reality can be quantified. We can quantify. We can use surveillance, evidence-based deduction, and inference prediction. We can do component analysis and integration. Numerical data can be summarized into mood, median, measures of central tendency. What are our thoughts? Basically, that health-related disciplines and basic sciences are introduced constructively. Objectives portray outsiders' view, and there is detachment and impartiality. And then we have practical implementation. A good example, we have genotypes, abundance, geographical characteristics, etc. So when we draw a triangle, for example, to represent as a symbol of a mountain, it is actually a real mountain that exists. So as your guess is, when we look at reality in an objective way, then we are likely to apply quantitative research methods. Okay. On the other end, we have constructivism. In constructivism, reality is internal to the knower, and it is about perception and intuition. The mind is a builder of samples, and these samples may or may not be represented statistically. At times we have mental models and conceptual socio-ecological systems which are conceptualized for problem solving. Under constructivism, we have thoughts being perceptions, imaginations, abstract thoughts. The meaning basically does not rely on real-world correspondence, but is determined by the person who is understanding it or understander. The symbols and tools we develop under constructivism basically represent internal reality, what is in my mind. So, if today I decide that when I draw a lion, it is basically means it is a reincarnated great-grandfather, for example. It may not make sense to you, but that lion is an internal, or it's a representation of my internal reality. You cannot tell me whether I am right or wrong. It is my reality. You cannot challenge it. So as you would guess, then the methods applied in constructivism are basically qualitative methods. These qualitative methods have to be socio-culturally sensitive because we accept diverse perspective, contextualization, indigenous knowledge. You'll hear some of the methods we use a grounded theory, inductive theory. We have different research instruments and methodological approaches when we are looking at qualitative studies or constructivism. We need to appreciate the multiple perspectives, which are usually socially constructed and based on social and ecological sciences. Psychology, public health, all often rely on constructivism. We need to have an empathetic understanding of the ethnic insiders or indigenous knowledge and have personal involvement, yet not be partial. If you ever want to remember any word on constructivism and research methods applied in constructivism, always remember empathy. Don't go to judge. On the other hand, we need to understand the ecosystems from within the subjective ecosystem. So, we include mental, social, and spiritual perspectives of the phenomenon we are interested in studying. Those are big words. Let's simplify them in one simple diagram, and just remember, objectivism looks at a real, tangible world. Therefore, it leans towards positivism. Reality is a concrete structure. Reality is constructed through a concrete process. Constructivism, on the other side, will lean towards interpretivism. So, we construct reality, and reality is a projection of what is in my mind. That line, or that, the number line, is continuous because in reality, it should actually be a continuum. So when we apply that knowledge in research, we look at it as a continuum. One, ontology, which is what do we need to know, what reality is out there, varies on one extreme side of a continuum to realism and the other one relativism. Epistemology, on the other side, looks at more or moves towards positivism, while on the extreme end we have constructivism or interpretivism. How do we find out, or what methodologies do we use when it comes to objectivism, positivism, realism? We lean towards quantitative research methods. When it comes to constructivism and subjective reality, then we lean towards qualitative research methods. In a nutshell, we basically talked about ontology. That refers to what exists, the reality, and our view of the nature of that reality. Then we talked about epistemology, and we basically looked at the perceived relationship with knowledge, and we are asking ourselves, are we part of the knowledge? Is it within us? Is it without us? And if it is without us or outside of us, then it means it's objective. And if it's within us, then it means it's subjective. And so, how does epistemology inform our methodology? And we have said, when we have objectivism, then we apply quantitative methods. When we have constructivism, then we apply qualitative methods in discovering and creating knowledge. I will share with you a number of references you can use to read further and understand. I know this is a very simplified overview, and it's just meant to make us go and read further. We need to be keen on our philosophical basis of doing research. So the next time you're defending your work, or you're deciding what research design, for example, you want to apply, you need to ask yourself, what philosophical basis, what epistemological underpinning is guiding my research? Until next time, I wish you the best. Please, if you need to ask any questions or you need us to clarify a few of those aspects, I have shared my number and my email at the end of this slide. So have a beautiful one, and let's see how we apply philosophy and epistemological basis or decisions to direct our research. Thank you.